I spent 28 years with the Chicago Police Department, and the last thing I expected in retirement was to investigate my own neighbors. But here I am with a violation notice in my hand for installing security cameras on my own property. My name is Thomas Garrison, and after 3 decades of dealing with everything from petty theft to organized crime, I moved to Lakewood Estates in Naperville, Illinois, hoping for peace and quiet. The subdivision looked perfect when my wife Janet and I first toured it back in 2022. Tree-lined streets, well-maintained homes, and enough distance from the city to feel like a real escape. We bought a nice colonial-style house with a 2-car garage and a decent backyard. Janet passed away from cancer 6 months after we moved in, and suddenly, this big house felt emptier than any crime scene I'd ever worked. I threw myself into fixing up the place, keeping busy to avoid the silence. One of the first things I did was install a comprehensive security system with 4 cameras covering the front yard, driveway, side entrance, and backyard. Old habits die hard, and after seeing what I'd seen on the job, I wasn't about to leave my property vulnerable. The cameras were discreet, professional-grade equipment that I got through a friend still on the force. Nothing ostentatious, just good solid surveillance. 3 weeks after installation, I found the letter in my mailbox. Typed on official Lakewood Estates HOA letterhead, it informed me that I was in violation of Section 7.3 of the Community Guidelines regarding unauthorized external modifications, and that I had 14 days to remove the cameras or face a fine of $500. The letter was signed by Patricia Morrison, HOA president. I read it twice, standing there in my driveway in the September heat. The thing that got me wasn't even the demand itself, but the tone. Authoritative, cold, no room for discussion. It reminded me of the bureaucratic nonsense I'd dealt with downtown, except this time it was about my own home. I called the number listed on the letterhead that afternoon. A woman answered on the 3rd ring, her voice sharp and nasal. Lakewood Estates, HOA, Patricia speaking. Hi Patricia, this is Thomas Garrison over on Maple Drive. I received a notice about my security cameras. Oh yes, Mr. Garrison, those need to come down. They're not approved. I wasn't aware I needed approval for security equipment on my own property, I said, keeping my voice level. The cameras don't point at anyone else's home. They're just covering my own yard and entrances. That's irrelevant. Section 7.3 is very clear. Any external modifications require board approval, and security cameras create an atmosphere of distrust in our community. We pride ourselves on being a safe, welcoming neighborhood. The phrase atmosphere of distrust almost made me laugh. I'd worked neighborhoods where people installed cameras because they'd been robbed 3 times in a month. This wasn't about safety or community. This was about control. I'd like to appeal this decision, I said. When's your next board meeting? There was a pause, and I could hear papers shuffling. The next meeting is October 5th at 7 p.m. in the community center. You may address the board during the homeowner comment period. I'll be there. The cameras still need to come down by the deadline, Mr. Garrison. The fine will be assessed if they're not removed. We'll see, I said and hung up. I spent the next 2 weeks doing what I did best, gathering information. I pulled out my copy of the HOA bylaws and guidelines, reading through every section with the same attention I'd given to case files. Section 7.3 did mention external modifications, but the language was vague enough to be interpreted multiple ways. It talked about structures, additions, and paint colors, but nothing specifically about security equipment. I also noticed that several other homes in the subdivision had doorbell cameras, which technically should fall under the same rule. I drove around Lakewood Estates one afternoon, documenting everything. The subdivision had about 200 homes spread across winding streets with names like Willow Court and Oak Ridge Lane. I counted 17 doorbell cameras, 3 homes with solar panels that definitely qualified as external modifications, and 1 house that had installed a decorative fountain in the front yard without any apparent issues. The inconsistency was what bothered me. Either the rules applied to everyone or they didn't. Selective enforcement was a red flag, something I'd seen too many times in corrupt systems. October 5th came around, and I showed up at the community center 15 minutes early. The building was a small brick structure near the subdivision entrance, with a meeting room that held about 50 people. When I walked in, only a handful of residents were scattered across the folding chairs. At the front, a table was set up with 5 chairs behind it. Patricia Morrison sat in the center seat. I recognized her immediately. Mid-50s, blonde hair cut in that sharp bob that never moved, wearing a navy blazer like she was chairing a corporate board meeting instead of a neighborhood association. The 4 other board members looked less enthusiastic about being there. 2 men in their 40s who kept checking their phones, an elderly woman who seemed half asleep, and a younger woman who was organizing papers with nervous energy. Patricia called the meeting to order at exactly 7 p.m., going through the standard agenda items. Approval of last month's minutes, treasurer's report, discussion about the pool maintenance schedule. I sat through it all, watching how she ran things. She dominated every conversation, cutting off the other board members when they tried to contribute, making decisions without really consulting anyone. The younger woman tried to suggest a different vendor for landscaping, and Patricia shut her down in 3 sentences. When they finally reached the homeowner comment period, Patricia looked directly at me. "Mr. Garrison, I believe you wanted to address the board." I stood up and walked to the front, carrying a folder with my documentation. "Thank you. I'm here about the violation notice I received regarding my security cameras. I'd like to explain why I believe this is an unfair application of the HOA guidelines." "The guidelines are clear," Patricia interrupted. "External modifications require approval. Let me finish, please." I used the voice I'd developed over years of interrogations, firm but not aggressive. "I've reviewed Section 7.3 in detail, and while it does mention modifications, it focuses primarily on structural changes and aesthetics. Security cameras are safety equipment, not decorative modifications. They're no different than doorbell cameras, which I counted 17 of throughout the neighborhood, none of which appear to have been subject to violation notices." One of the male board members, wearing a golf shirt with a real estate company logo, leaned forward. "He's got a point, Patricia. The Hendersons just installed a Ring doorbell last month. Doorbell cameras are different," Patricia said quickly. "They're minimal and serve a specific function." "My cameras serve the exact same function," I replied. "They're deterrents against theft and vandalism, and they provide evidence if a crime occurs. After spending my career as a detective with the Chicago Police Department, I'm not comfortable leaving my property unsecured." The older woman on the board perked up at that. "You were a police officer." 28 years, madam. Retired last year." Patricia's expression hardened. "Your professional background doesn't exempt you from community rules, Mr. Garrison, and I'm concerned about privacy issues. Your cameras could be recording other residents. They're angled to cover only my property. I have screenshots showing the camera views if you'd like to see them." I pulled out printed images from my folder. "Front camera covers my driveway and porch. Side camera covers the walkway between my house and garage. Back cameras cover my yard and rear entrance, no angles toward neighboring properties. I passed the images to the board members. The golf shirt guy studied them and nodded. These look pretty reasonable to me. Patricia barely glanced at them. It sets a precedent. If we allow this, soon everyone will want to install cameras and our neighborhood will look like a prison yard. Or it will be safer, I countered. Crime doesn't stop at subdivision borders. In fact, affluent neighborhoods are often targets for property theft because of the assumption that expensive items are inside. The younger board member spoke up for the first time. Mrs. Morrison, maybe we could establish guidelines for security cameras rather than banning them outright. Specifications about placement, size, visibility. The matter isn't up for debate tonight, Patricia snapped. Mr. Garrison was given his notice and the deadline stands. If the cameras aren't removed, the fine will be assessed. Then I'm formally appealing this decision and requesting a vote from the full board, I said. The golf shirt guy raised his hand. I'd support that motion. Patricia's face flushed. Fine. We'll schedule a vote for next month's meeting. But understand, Mr. Garrison, the fine still applies if the cameras remain past your deadline. I'll take my chances, I said and returned to my seat. The meeting wrapped up shortly after, and as people filed out, the older woman from the board approached me. She introduced herself as Helen, and she'd lived in Lakewood Estates for 12 years. Don't take Patricia too personally, she said quietly. She's been president for 4 years and it's gone to her head. Between you and me, a lot of us are tired of how she runs things. Why don't you vote her out? Helen sighed. Most people don't come to meetings or vote in elections. Patricia gets re-elected because she's the only one who runs. She treats this like her personal fiefdom. That explained a lot. I thanked Helen for the information and headed home, already thinking about my next steps. The deadline came and went. I didn't remove the cameras. 3 days later, another letter arrived, informing me that a $500 fine had been added to my HOA account, and that failure to pay within 30 days would result in additional penalties and possible legal action. I filed the letter with the others and waited for the next board meeting. But something else happened first, something that changed everything. It was a Tuesday night, mid-October, around 11 p.m. I was in my study reviewing some documentation I'd requested from the county about HOA regulations when my phone buzzed with a motion alert from my security system. I pulled up the app and switched to the camera feed. The front camera showed 2 figures approaching my house from the street. They were wearing dark clothing and hoodies, faces obscured. At first, I thought maybe it was teenagers pulling pranks, but their body language was wrong. Too purposeful, too careful. They moved up my driveway, looking around to check if anyone was watching. I grabbed my phone and my old service weapon from the safe, moving to the front window where I could see without being obvious. The 2 figures had reached my front yard now, and one of them was carrying something. A spray paint can. The other had what looked like a hammer. They weren't kids. Even in the dark, I could tell from their builds and movements that these were adults, and they were about to vandalize my property. I watched as the one with spray paint moved toward my front door while the other approached my mailbox. The camera caught everything in clear detail. Then the one with the paint raised the can toward my door, and that's when I turned on the exterior lights and stepped out onto my porch. I'd stop right there if I were you, I called out. They both froze. In the bright LED lights, I got my first good look at them. Both appeared to be in their late 40s or early 50s, one man and one woman. The woman was holding the spray paint can, her face a mask of shock under the hood. The man with the hammer took a step back. "Drop what you're holding and stay where you are," I said, keeping my weapon behind my back but ready. I've already called the police, and you're both on camera. The woman's eyes darted to the camera above my door, then back to me. I saw the moment recognition hit her face, followed by panic. She threw down the spray paint can and turned to run, but the man grabbed her arm. "Patricia, don't," he hissed, and my blood went cold. Patricia Morrison, the HOA president, standing in my front yard at 11 p.m. with spray paint and a hammer, caught on camera trying to vandalize my property. "Mrs. Morrison," I said, my voice dropping into detective mode, "I suggest you both stay put. Running will only make this worse." The man was pulling at her arm, clearly wanting to bolt, but Patricia seemed paralyzed. The situation was probably sinking in for her now. A retired cop with cameras catching her red-handed committing criminal damage to property. Sirens wailed in the distance. I'd actually called 911 the moment I saw them on my property, using the speed dial feature while I was still inside. Patricia's companion made his decision then, yanking his arm free from her grip and sprinting down the street. Patricia stood there, spray paint can at her feet, looking up at me with an expression somewhere between fury and terror. "You can run too if you want," I told her. "But I've got your face on camera, your voice recorded, and a witness who just identified you by name. The smart play is to stay put." She stayed. 2 Naperville PD cruisers pulled up within minutes, lights flashing. 4 officers emerged, hands on their weapons until they assessed the situation. I kept my hands visible and explained who I was, that my service weapon was secured behind my back, and that I had a suspect detained in my front yard. The lead officer, a sergeant named Martinez who looked about 30, approached carefully. "Mr. Garrison, you called about attempted vandalism." "That's right. 2 suspects approached my property with intent to commit criminal damage. I have the entire incident recorded on my security system. 1 suspect fled on foot heading east on Maple Drive. The other is right there." I nodded toward Patricia, who was now sitting on my front steps with her head in her hands. Another officer moved to Patricia while Martinez came up to the porch. "You're the retired detective from Chicago. 28 years with CPD, retired last year." He relaxed slightly. "Okay. Can you walk me through what happened?" I gave him the timeline while another officer collected the spray paint can and hammer as evidence. Patricia was read her Miranda rights and placed in the back of a cruiser. Through it all, she didn't say a word, just stared straight ahead with her jaw clenched. "You said you have video," Martinez asked. "Complete footage from motion detection to now. I can provide copies immediately if you want to bring in a flash drive, or I can email the files." "Let's get it now." "We'll need a statement too." I spent the next 2 hours at the Naperville Police Department, providing my statement and the video evidence. Martinez reviewed the footage multiple times, particularly the part where Patricia's companion called her by name. "This is pretty damning," he said. "You got a clear shot of both their faces, the attempted vandalism, everything. Do you know who the second suspect is?" "I have suspicions. Based on context and the fact that he was with Patricia Morrison, I'd guess it's her husband. I can probably identify him from HOA records or community photos." "That would be helpful. We've got units looking for him now." By the time I got home, it was past 2 a.m. I was exhausted but also wired with adrenaline. This wasn't how I expected my retirement to go, but I couldn't say I wasn't suited for it. The investigative instincts never really shut off. The next morning, I received a visit from Detective Sarah Chen with the Naperville Police Department. She was handling the case now that it had moved beyond the initial response. "Mr. Garrison, thank you for your cooperation last night," she said, when I invited her into my living room. "I've reviewed your video footage and your statement." Patricia Morrison is being charged with attempted criminal damage to property and trespassing. We picked up her husband, Derek Morrison, at their home this morning. He's being charged with the same offenses plus fleeing the scene. Have they said why they did it? I asked, though I had my theories. Detective Chen gave me a knowing look. Mrs. Morrison isn't talking, invoked her right to an attorney immediately. Mr. Morrison is claiming they were just walking through the neighborhood and you assaulted them. I actually laughed at that. Good luck selling that story with the video showing them carrying spray paint and a hammer onto my property at 11 p.m. My thoughts exactly. I understand there's been an ongoing dispute between you and the HOA about your security cameras. That's correct. Patricia Morrison, in her capacity as HOA president, sent me violation notices and assessed a fine for refusing to remove them. The cameras, ironically, are what caught her trying to vandalize my property. The irony isn't lost on me, Detective Chen said with a slight expression of amusement. I need to ask, do you think this was retaliation for the HOA dispute? I can't prove motive, but the timing is suspicious. She wanted the cameras gone, I refused, and then she shows up with spray paint. Doesn't take a detective to connect those dots. We're pursuing it as retaliation, which could add additional charges. I'll keep you updated as the case progresses. In the meantime, if you experience any other incidents, contact us immediately. After she left, I sat down with coffee and my laptop to do what I should have done weeks ago: dig deeper into the HOA's operations. I started with public records, pulling information about the HOA's finances, board meeting minutes, and any legal actions. What I found was interesting. Lakewood Estates, HOA, had been involved in 3 lawsuits over the past 4 years, all during Patricia Morrison's tenure as president. 2 were from homeowners contesting fines and violations, and 1 was from a contractor claiming non-payment for services. All 3 cases had been settled out of court, but the details suggested a pattern of aggressive enforcement and questionable financial management. I also found multiple complaints filed with the Illinois Attorney General's office regarding HOA governance issues. Most were about Patricia specifically. Accusations of selective rule enforcement, unauthorized spending, and intimidation of homeowners who questioned her authority. The deeper I dug, the more it looked like Patricia had been running Lakewood Estates like her personal kingdom, using violation notices and fines as weapons against anyone who challenged her. My security cameras weren't the real issue. The issue was that I'd stood up to her. Over the next few days, word spread through the neighborhood about Patricia's arrest. My doorbell rang constantly with neighbors wanting to know what happened. Some were shocked, others seemed less surprised than they should have been. Helen, the older board member, came by with a casserole and a sympathetic expression. I heard what happened. Are you all right? I'm fine, Helen. Thanks for checking. She sat down in my living room looking troubled. Thomas, I need to tell you something. This isn't the first time Patricia has done something like this. That got my attention. What do you mean? 3 years ago, there was a homeowner named Richard Chen who opposed Patricia on several issues. He was vocal at meetings, challenging her decisions. One night, his car got keyed in his driveway. No proof of who did it, but Richard always suspected it was Patricia or someone she put up to it. Did he report it? To the police, yes, but there was no evidence. He moved away about 6 months later. Said he couldn't deal with the harassment anymore. What kind of harassment? Helen sighed. Constant violation notices for minor things. His grass was a 1/4 inch too long. His holiday decorations stayed up 2 days past the deadline. His garbage cans were visible from the street for an hour after pickup. Patricia went after him relentlessly until he gave up and sold his house. This was starting to paint a picture I didn't like. Were there others? A few. Patricia has a way of targeting people who don't fall in line. Most homeowners just comply because it's easier than fighting. But you're different. You actually know how to fight back. I spent my career dealing with bullies in uniform, I said. I'm not about to cave to one running an HOA. Helen smiled sadly. I'm glad you're standing up to her. But be careful. Patricia doesn't take losing well. After Helen left, I spent the evening compiling everything I'd learned. If this was going to court, I wanted a complete picture of Patricia's pattern of behavior. The attempted vandalism wasn't an isolated incident. It was an escalation of an ongoing pattern of abuse of authority. The preliminary hearing was scheduled for early November. I showed up at the DuPage County Courthouse, prepared to testify if needed. Patricia and Derek Morrison were both present with their attorney, a slick-looking guy in an expensive suit who probably cost more than my first car. The hearing was brief. The prosecution presented the video evidence and witness statements, including mine. Patricia's attorney tried to argue entrapment, claiming I'd deliberately provoked his clients by refusing to comply with HOA regulations. The judge shut that down immediately. Counselor, non-compliance with HOA guidelines, even if legitimate, doesn't justify criminal trespassing and attempted vandalism. Your clients were caught on camera with the implements and intent to damage property. Do you have any actual defense to present? The attorney requested a continuance to prepare, which was granted. The trial was set for January. Both Patricia and Derek were released on bond with the condition that they have no contact with me. Meanwhile, the HOA was in chaos. Patricia had been suspended from the board pending the outcome of the criminal case, and the remaining 4 members were trying to figure out how to function without her. An emergency meeting was called for mid-November to discuss interim leadership and address the growing list of issues that had been ignored while Patricia focused on her personal vendettas. I attended that meeting, along with about 60 other homeowners. It was the biggest turnout the community center had seen in years. Everyone wanted to know what was happening with the board and what would happen to the neighborhood's reputation. The golf shirt guy, whose name I learned was Brian, took the lead. First, I want to thank everyone for coming tonight. I know there are a lot of questions and concerns. The board takes the recent events very seriously, and we're committed to transparent, fair governance going forward. A hand shot up from the audience. Is Patricia going to be removed from the board permanently? That will depend on the outcome of the criminal case, Brian said carefully. If she's convicted, our bylaws have provisions for removal of board members who commit crimes. In the meantime, she's suspended from all duties and decision-making. Another resident stood up. What about all the fines and violations she issued? Are those being reviewed? The younger board member, whose name was Jennifer, spoke up. We're conducting a comprehensive review of all violations issued in the past 2 years. If we find evidence of selective enforcement or unjustified penalties, those decisions will be reversed and fines refunded. That caused a murmur of approval through the crowd. Several people started sharing their own stories of Patricia's overzealous enforcement, and I realized just how many people she'd bullied over the years. The picture that emerged was of someone who'd used the HOA as a personal tool for control and intimidation. When the floor opened for general comments, I stood up. Thomas Garrison, Maple Drive. I appreciate the board's commitment to reviewing past decisions. I'd also like to request that the board formally establish clear guidelines for security cameras and other safety equipment. What happened to me shouldn't happen to anyone else, and having specific, written standards would prevent future disputes. Helen raised her hand. I motioned that we create a committee to draft those guidelines, with input from homeowners and security professionals. "Seconded," said another board member. Brian nodded. "Motion carries. We'll put out a call for committee volunteers next week." The meeting continued for another hour, covering everything from pool maintenance to street repair schedules. For the first time since I'd moved to Lakewood Estates, it actually felt like a community working together instead of subjects being ruled over. As people filed out, several neighbors approached me to thank me for standing up to Patricia. One older gentleman shook my hand vigorously. "You did what a lot of us were too scared to do. Thank you." "I just installed some cameras," I said. "You did more than that. You exposed what was really going on here." Walking home that night, I felt something I hadn't felt in a while, a sense of purpose. Maybe retirement didn't mean checking out from the world. Maybe it just meant finding new ways to apply the skills I'd spent a lifetime developing. December came with the first snow, and Lakewood Estates started to look like a postcard with white-covered roofs and twinkling holiday lights. The Security Camera Guidelines Committee had finished their work, presenting a comprehensive but reasonable set of standards that would allow homeowners to install security equipment while maintaining the neighborhood's aesthetic. The board approved it unanimously. My own violation was formally rescinded, and the $500 fine was refunded with a written apology from the board. Brian delivered it personally. "I'm sorry for how this was handled," he said. "Patricia shouldn't have gone after you like that, and the rest of us should have pushed back sooner." "Lesson learned," I said. "Power without oversight leads to abuse. That's true whether it's a police department or a homeowner association." The trial began on January 15th, a cold Tuesday morning with fresh snow on the ground. I'd been subpoenaed as a witness, so I showed up in my best suit, prepared to testify. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, with maybe 20 seats for observers. Several of my neighbors had come to watch, including Helen and Brian. Patricia and Derek sat at the defense table with their attorney, both looking considerably less confident than they had at the preliminary hearing. The prosecution built their case methodically. They presented the video evidence first, playing it on a large screen for the jury. Watching it again, I was struck by how damning it was. The footage showed Patricia and Derek approaching my property, looking around furtively, and then preparing to vandalize my door and mailbox. The audio caught Derek saying Patricia's name clearly, and the spray paint can and hammer were visible in every frame. Then it was my turn to testify. The prosecutor, a sharp woman named Amanda Richardson, walked me through the events of that night. "Mr. Garrison, can you describe what you saw on your security camera feed at approximately 11 p.m. on October 17th? I received a motion alert on my phone and checked the camera. I saw two individuals dressed in dark clothing approaching my property from the street. Their behavior immediately struck me as suspicious based on my training and experience." "What kind of training and experience?" "I served as a detective with the Chicago Police Department for 28 years. I've responded to thousands of calls involving property crimes, vandalism, and suspicious activity. The way these individuals moved, the time of night, the fact that they were carrying objects and repeatedly looking around to see if they were being watched, all indicated criminal intent." "What did you do next?" "I called 911 and then observed from my front window. When I saw one of the suspects raise a spray paint can toward my front door, I activated my exterior lights and confronted them verbally." "Did you recognize either of the suspects?" "Not initially. They were wearing hoodies that obscured their faces. However, when the male suspect grabbed the female suspect's arm to flee, he said her name, Patricia. Combined with the context of our ongoing HOA dispute, I immediately suspected it was Patricia Morrison. Objection, the defense attorney said. Speculation. Sustained, the judge said. Mr. Garrison, please stick to what you directly observed. Apologies, Your Honor. I heard the name Patricia spoken clearly, and when the lights illuminated the suspects' faces, I recognized Patricia Morrison from multiple interactions at HOA meetings. The prosecutor continued. Had you had any disputes with Mrs. Morrison prior to this incident? Yes, Mrs. Morrison, in her capacity as HOA president, had issued me violation notices for my security cameras and assessed a $500 fine. I was in the process of appealing that decision through the HOA's formal procedures. So there was ongoing tension between you and Mrs. Morrison regarding these same security cameras that ultimately captured her attempting to vandalize your property. Objection, leading. I'll rephrase. Was there ongoing tension? Yes, there was a disagreement about the cameras. The defense attorney's cross-examination focused on trying to establish that I'd somehow provoked the incident. Mr. Garrison, isn't it true that you deliberately refused to comply with HOA regulations as a way of asserting dominance? No. I refused to remove legal security equipment from my property because I believed the HOA's interpretation of the guidelines was incorrect and unfairly applied. But you knew your refusal would anger Mrs. Morrison. I expected she would be frustrated, yes. I didn't expect her to commit a crime. Isn't it possible that my clients were simply walking through the neighborhood and you misinterpreted their innocent actions? I almost felt bad for him. That was the best defense he had, and it was terrible. Sir, the video clearly shows your clients carrying spray paint and a hammer onto my property at 11 p.m., approaching my front door with the clear intent to deface it. There's no innocent interpretation of those facts. He tried a few more angles, but nothing stuck. The video was too clear, the circumstances too damning. Derek Morrison took the stand in his own defense, which I thought was a mistake. He claimed they'd been out for a late-night walk and had found the spray paint and hammer on the sidewalk, picking them up to dispose of them properly. When asked why they walked onto my property instead of continuing to a trash can, he fumbled. We were just, curious about his cameras. We'd heard about them. So you approached Mr. Garrison's property at 11 p.m. to look at his cameras while carrying spray paint and a hammer. The prosecutor asked. We didn't mean any harm. Then why did you run when confronted? I got scared. He's a cop. He could have had a gun. Mr. Garrison identified himself and asked you to stay put. He didn't threaten you with a weapon. Why run if you'd done nothing wrong? Derek had no good answer for that. Patricia's attorney had wisely advised her not to testify, so the jury never heard directly from her. But her silence spoke volumes. The closing arguments were straightforward. The prosecution laid out the timeline of the HOA dispute, the video evidence, and the lack of any credible innocent explanation for the defendant's behavior. The defense tried to create reasonable doubt by suggesting the video could be misinterpreted, and that the defendant's poor judgment didn't rise to criminal intent. The jury deliberated for 3 hours. When they returned, the verdict was guilty on all counts for both Patricia and Derek Morrison. Attempted criminal damage to property, criminal trespass, and for Derek, an additional count of fleeing and eluding. Sentencing was set for February. As the bailiff led Patricia and Derek out of the courtroom, Patricia looked back at me with an expression of pure hatred. I met her gaze evenly. I'd seen that look before from a lot of people who'd made bad choices and wanted to blame someone else for the consequences. Outside the courthouse, several neighbors who'd attended the trial gathered around me. Helen hugged me carefully. Thank you for seeing this through. I just told the truth, I said. Brian shook my hand. The board is meeting next week to formally remove Patricia and hold elections for a new president. I hope you'll consider running. I laughed. I appreciate the thought, but I'm retired for a reason. I'll serve on committees and show up to meetings, but I'm not looking to run anything. Fair enough, but you've definitely made an impact here. Sentencing day arrived on February 20th. The courtroom was packed again, with even more neighbors showing up than had attended the trial. The judge reviewed the case file carefully before addressing Patricia and Derek. Mrs. Morrison, Mr. Morrison, you were both found guilty of attempting to vandalize your neighbor's property in retaliation for a personal dispute. This wasn't a youthful mistake or a momentary lapse in judgment. You planned and executed an act of petty vindictiveness that, had it succeeded, would have caused damage and distress to someone who had every right to install security equipment on his own property. The judge paused, looking directly at Patricia. Mrs. Morrison, you held a position of trust in your community as HOA president. Instead of using that position to serve your neighbors, you abused it to settle personal scores. That makes your conduct even more egregious. Patricia's attorney stood. Your Honor, my client has no prior criminal record and has suffered significant consequences already, including loss of her position and reputation in the community. We request leniency. I've considered that, the judge said. But I've also considered the victim impact statement from Mr. Garrison and the letters from numerous residents describing a pattern of harassment and abuse of authority. This wasn't an isolated incident. It was the culmination of years of misconduct. The judge sentenced Patricia to 1 year in county jail, suspended to 2 years of probation, 500 hours of community service, and restitution to me for court costs and any damages. Derek received a similar sentence with an additional requirement to attend anger management counseling. Additionally, both were barred from holding any position in a homeowner association for 5 years and had to attend courses on conflict resolution and community governance. As we left the courthouse, Detective Chen caught up with me. Good outcome, she said. Doesn't always work out this cleanly. No, it doesn't, I agreed. But sometimes the system works the way it's supposed to. The aftermath rippled through Lakewood Estates for months. The board held elections in March, and Jennifer, the younger board member who'd pushed for the camera guidelines, was elected president. She ran on a platform of transparency, fairness, and actual community building rather than enforcement for its own sake. One of her first acts was to establish an ombudsman position, a neutral party who could mediate disputes between homeowners and the board before they escalated. Brian volunteered for the role, and he turned out to be good at it, finding compromises that satisfied both the need for community standards and individual homeowner rights. The security camera guidelines I'd inadvertently inspired became a model that other HOAs in the area started adopting. I got a call from a reporter at the Daily Herald who wanted to do a story about it. I declined to be interviewed, but I did provide a written statement about the importance of balancing security with aesthetics and the need for HOA governance to be fair and consistent. As spring arrived and the snow melted, Lakewood Estates felt like a different place. More people came to board meetings. Neighbors actually talked to each other instead of nervously avoiding controversy. The oppressive atmosphere that Patricia had created lifted, replaced by something that felt more like an actual community. I kept busy with the garden, finally tackling the landscaping projects Janet and I had planned before she got sick. I planted roses in the backyard, her favorite. Every time I worked in the dirt, I felt close to her again, imagining what she would have said about the whole HOA drama. She would have laughed, probably. Janet always said I couldn't help being a cop, even when I wasn't working. She'd been right. One evening in late April, I was sitting on my back porch with a beer, watching the sunset when my phone rang. It was a number I didn't recognize, but with a Chicago area code. "Thomas Garrison," I answered. "Detective Garrison. This is Captain Williams from the 18th District." "I don't know if you remember me." I did, vaguely. Williams had been a sergeant when I retired, working organized crime. "Sure, Captain. What can I do for you? I heard about what happened with your HOA situation. Word gets around. I wanted to reach out because we're looking for someone to help with our Community Policing Advisory Board. It's a volunteer position, working with residents to improve police-community relations. Your name came up as someone who might be interested." I watched the sun sink lower, painting the sky orange and purple. "I'm retired, Captain, living in the suburbs now." "I know, but you've still got the instincts and the experience, and from what I heard, you've got a talent for dealing with community issues. We could use someone like you, even if it's just a few hours a month." I thought about it. About Patricia and the HOA and how much damage one person with unchecked authority could do. About the satisfaction I'd felt when justice was served and when the community came together afterward. "Let me think about it," I said. "Can I call you back in a few days?" "Absolutely. No pressure. Just wanted to put it on your radar." After we hung up, I sat there for a long time thinking. Retirement was supposed to be about relaxation, about leaving the job behind. But maybe that wasn't really who I was. Maybe I was someone who needed to be useful, to apply the skills I'd spent a lifetime developing toward making things better. The security cameras kept recording, motion sensors detecting the occasional cat or raccoon passing through my yard. I'd review the footage, sometimes out of habit, making sure everything was secure. The cameras had served their purpose, catching Patricia in the act and providing undeniable evidence. But more than that, they'd become a symbol of something larger: the right to feel safe in your own home and the importance of standing up to those who abuse authority. I finished my beer and went inside, passing through rooms that no longer felt quite so empty. The house was becoming mine, not just the place where Janet and I had lived, but something new. A home base for whatever came next. The next morning, I called Captain Williams back. "I'm interested in the advisory board position. Tell me more about what's involved." We talked for 30 minutes about the role, the time commitment, and the goals. It sounded challenging and worthwhile, a way to bridge the gap between police and communities that had grown too wide in recent years. "When can you start?" Williams asked. "Whenever you need me." "Great. First meeting is next Tuesday at 6 p.m. I'll email you the details." After hanging up, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time: excitement about the future. Not just contentment or acceptance, but actual anticipation. That weekend, the Lakewood Estates community held a spring barbecue at the park near the subdivision entrance. It was Jennifer's idea, a way to bring people together without the formality of board meetings or the tension of enforcement actions. Just neighbors being neighborly. I almost didn't go, but Helen stopped by to insist. "You're part of this community, Thomas. People want to see you." So I went, bringing a case of beer and my old portable grill. The park was packed with families, kids running around, adults standing in clusters talking and laughing. Someone had set up a volleyball net. Music played from a Bluetooth speaker. It was exactly what a community event should be. Brian waved me over to where he was manning a massive grill loaded with burgers and hot dogs. "Thomas, glad you made it. Beer's in the coolers, help yourself." I grabbed a drink and found myself in conversation with various neighbors. Some I'd spoken to before, others I was meeting for the first time. They asked about my career with CPD, about retirement, about my plans. I told them about the advisory board position, and several people expressed interest in similar volunteer work. Helen appeared at my elbow with a plate of food. "You need to eat. You're too skinny." "I'm fine, Helen." "You're not fine. You're a widower living alone who probably eats cereal for dinner half the time. I've been where you are. You need people." She wasn't wrong. I took the plate. "Thank you. And I heard about the police advisory board. That's good. Janet would be proud of you for getting involved again." The mention of Janet caught me off guard. "You didn't know her." "We moved here right before she got sick." I knew her a little. She came to one board meeting early on, asked about the gardening club. She was lovely, and she talked about you with such pride. Helen smiled. "She said you were the kind of man who couldn't stand by when something was wrong, that you'd always find a way to help." She was right. I didn't trust myself to speak for a moment. Finally, I managed. "She always saw me better than I saw myself. That's what love does." "But she wasn't wrong, Thomas. Look what you did here. You could have removed your cameras and avoided all the trouble. Instead, you stood up to a bully and exposed a pattern of abuse. Because of you, this community is better. That's who you are." The afternoon faded into evening, and the barbecue continued under string lights someone had hung in the trees. Kids roasted marshmallows while adults settled into camp chairs with drinks, conversation flowing easily. This was what Lakewood Estates was supposed to be, what it could be without someone like Patricia Morrison poisoning the atmosphere. Around 9 p.m., Jennifer stood up and clinked a glass to get everyone's attention. "I just want to say thank you all for coming out tonight. This is what community looks like. Not violation notices and fines, but people coming together, supporting each other, making this neighborhood a place we're proud to call home." There was applause and a few cheers. Jennifer continued, "I also want to acknowledge someone who reminded us all what it means to stand up for what's right. Thomas Garrison, would you stand up for a second?" I really didn't want to, but Helen gave me a look that said I didn't have a choice. I stood awkwardly while Jennifer continued. "Thomas could have taken the easy road and removed his security cameras. Instead, he fought for a principle, and in doing so, he exposed problems in our HOA that needed fixing. Thanks to his courage, we've made real changes here. We have clearer guidelines, better oversight, and a commitment to fairness. So thank you, Thomas." More applause. I nodded acknowledgement and sat down as quickly as possible. Public recognition had never been my thing. I'd spent my career doing the work without needing credit for it. But as I looked around at the faces of my neighbors, illuminated by firelight and string lights, I realized something. This was why I'd become a cop in the first place, all those years ago. Not for the adrenaline or the detective work, though I'd enjoyed both. But for this, the feeling of making a difference, of protecting people, of helping communities be what they were supposed to be. Retirement didn't mean giving that up. It just meant finding new ways to do it. The spring turned to summer, and life settled into a routine. I worked with the police advisory board twice a month, helping to develop policies and programs that would rebuild trust between law enforcement and the communities they served. It was challenging work, requiring me to listen more than talk, to understand perspectives different from my own. In Lakewood Estates, the changes continued. The HOA implemented a new system for dispute resolution, created clearer guidelines for everything from holiday decorations to property modifications, and established term limits for board members. Patricia's era of one-person rule was over, replaced by actual democratic governance. I heard through Helen that Patricia and Derek had moved out of Lakewood Estates in June, selling their house quickly and relocating somewhere in Indiana. Patricia was completing her community service at a food bank and reportedly keeping her head down. I hoped she'd learned something from the experience, though I wasn't counting on it. Some people never accepted responsibility for their actions. My cameras kept recording, a quiet digital sentinel watching over my property. I checked the footage occasionally, more out of habit than necessity. The neighborhood felt safer now, not because of technology, but because people looked out for each other. In July, I was elected to the security committee, working with other homeowners to develop best practices for home security throughout the subdivision. We organized a workshop with the Naperville Police Department, bringing in officers to discuss crime prevention and safety measures. Nearly 100 residents showed up, asking questions and sharing concerns. One evening after the workshop, a younger couple approached me. They just moved to Lakewood Estates and had heard about the HOA situation. "We almost didn't buy here after we heard about the lawsuit and everything," the husband said. "But then we learned how the community responded, how you all made real changes. That's when we knew this was the right place." "Glad to have you here," I said. "And if you ever have concerns or issues, bring them up. That's what board meetings are for." The wife smiled. "That's what we love about this place. It actually feels like people care." That conversation stayed with me. What had started as a dispute over security cameras had become something much bigger. A reminder that communities were only as strong as their commitment to fairness and mutual respect. When those principles were violated, people had to stand up and fight back. August brought a heat wave, the kind that made Chicago summers legendary. I spent most of my time indoors, venturing out only in the early mornings to tend the garden. The roses were thriving, climbing the trellis I'd installed. I sent a photo to my daughter Emma in Seattle. She called immediately. "Dad, those are beautiful. Mom would have loved them." "I know. I think about her every time I see them bloom." "How are you doing, really?" "I'm good, sweetheart. Better than I've been in a while, staying busy, getting involved in the community. It's been good for me." "I heard about the HOA thing. That was crazy." "It was certainly more excitement than I expected in retirement," Emma laughed. "You can't help being a detective even when you're not on the job anymore." "That's what your mother used to say." She was right. She was right about a lot of things. We talked for another hour, catching up on her life, her work as an environmental engineer, her boyfriend who I'd met once and approved of. When we hung up, I felt grateful for the connection. Family mattered, even across the miles. September came around again, marking a full year since I'd installed the security cameras that had started everything. The leaves began to change, painting Lakewood Estates in shades of red and gold. I sat on my back porch one evening, watching the sunset and reflecting on the year. A year ago, I'd been frustrated and angry, dealing with an HOA president who'd abused her authority. Now, that same HOA was thriving under new leadership, with systems in place to prevent future abuses. The neighborhood felt different, more cohesive, more like an actual community. My cameras were still there, still recording, but they were no longer controversial. Several other homeowners had installed similar systems, following the guidelines we'd developed. Security wasn't seen as distrust anymore, but as simple common sense. The advisory board work in Chicago was making a difference too. We'd helped develop new training programs for officers, focusing on de-escalation and community engagement. We'd created opportunities for dialogue between police and residents, building bridges that had been burned over years of mutual suspicion. It wasn't perfect, and there was still a long way to go, but we were moving in the right direction. I thought about Patricia Morrison sometimes, wondering if she understood what had happened and why. She'd held power and used it poorly, alienating people instead of serving them. When someone challenged her authority, she'd escalated to criminal behavior rather than engage in good faith. It was a cautionary tale about what happened when power went unchecked, but I also thought about the good people I'd met through all of this. Helen with her casseroles and wisdom, Brian finding his calling as an ombudsman, Jennifer stepping up to lead with integrity. The neighbors who'd supported each other through the chaos and come out stronger on the other side. That was the real story, not the vandalism or the trial, but the way a community came together to fix itself. As fall deepened and the days grew shorter, I found myself content in a way I hadn't been since before Janet got sick. The grief was still there, probably always would be, but it had softened into something I could live with. The house was home now, filled with memories and purpose. I kept busy with the advisory board, the HOA security committee, and various volunteer projects. I traveled to Seattle to visit Emma for Thanksgiving, meeting her boyfriend's family and giving my tentative approval for their engagement plans. Life moved forward as it always did. The security cameras recorded everything, silent witnesses to the daily rhythms of suburban life. Delivery trucks, neighbors walking dogs, kids riding bikes, the occasional deer wandering through the yard. Nothing dramatic, just the ordinary moments that made up a life. And sometimes, late at night when I couldn't sleep, I'd pull up the footage from that October evening when Patricia and Derek Morrison had approached my property with spray paint and hammers. I'd watch myself step out onto the porch, watch them freeze in the lights, watch the whole confrontation unfold. It reminded me of who I was and what I stood for. A retired detective who couldn't ignore wrongdoing, even in retirement. A man who believed in justice and fairness and the rule of law. Someone who would always stand up to bullies, whether they wore badges or ran homeowner associations. The cameras had done their job, providing evidence that led to justice. But more importantly, they'd been a catalyst for change, exposing problems that needed fixing and forcing a community to confront its own dysfunction. As winter arrived and snow began to fall again on Lakewood Estates, I sat in my study with a cup of coffee, watching the camera feeds show a neighborhood putting up Christmas decorations. No violation notices would be issued for decorations that stayed up too long this year. No fines for creative displays that didn't meet arbitrary standards. Just families celebrating the holidays in their own ways, making their homes feel special. That was worth fighting for. That was worth all the trouble and stress and confrontation. Because at the end of the day, people deserve to feel safe and free in their own homes, to be treated fairly by those in authority, and to live in communities based on respect rather than fear. My phone buzzed with a text from Jennifer. The HOA board wanted to recognize me at the annual meeting with a community service award. I typed back that it wasn't necessary, but she insisted. So I'd show up and accept it graciously, because that's what you did in a community. You participated, even when it made you uncomfortable. The security cameras kept recording, documenting a neighborhood transformed. In the footage, you could see people talking to each other, helping with groceries, shoveling snow from each other's driveways. Small acts of kindness that added up to something meaningful. I'd come to Lakewood Estates looking for peace in retirement. Instead, I'd found purpose. Not the same purpose as my years with CPD, but something equally valuable. The work of building and maintaining community, of standing up for principles, of using experience and skills to make things better. Janet would have approved. She'd always said I was at my best when I was helping people, when I was fighting for what was right. She'd known me better than I knew myself. The cameras would keep recording, watching over my property and capturing whatever came next. But I knew now that security wasn't just about technology or surveillance. Real security came from living in a place where people looked out for each other, where authority was exercised fairly, and where standing up for principles was respected rather than punished. That's what made a home. Not just a house or a neighborhood, but a community of people committed to treating each other with dignity and respect. It had taken a conflict over security cameras and a criminal trial to get there, but Lakewood Estates had finally become what it was always supposed to be. And I'd found my place in it, not as an outsider or a troublemaker, but as a member of a community worth being part of. A retired detective who'd caught vandals in the act and helped transform a broken system into something better. The snow fell softly outside my window, covering everything in white. Inside, my house was warm and lived in, filled with memories of the past and possibilities for the future. The cameras recorded it all, silent witnesses to a life well lived and a community that had learned to be better. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything,